Yours says 385? What the fuck is going on? You can let them know they can get daily bonus points after completing all daily missions. What the fuck are the daily missions? All right. With that note, hopefully I'm not lagging. Let's get started. Page 84. Page 84. Page 84. The Angolan question. I would like to come to a situation in the United States and to look at the types of responses and to look. Wait. I'm going to reread it since we're starting. Okay, go. I would like to come to the situation in the United States and look at the types of responses and to look at what I consider to be some fairly horrendous mistakes which were made by certain forces in this country, the United States, in their approach to the Angolan question. Again, I will dismiss at least one element. We can dismiss those who are attempting to hire black mercenaries for FNLA, National Liberation Front in Angola, and UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. When this individual's Roy Enos, who took over the Congress of Radical Equality in 1968, purports to be organizing black mercenaries to go and fight in Africa, and when we know that mercenaries cost, whether they are black or white, and we know that this particular black functionary cannot afford to pay anybody. We know that these black mercenaries would have been paid by imperialism to go and fight in Angola. However, I think we can dismiss that as a reverent phenomenon, as the expression of a particularly reactionary and unresponsive force within black American politics environment. So we should really concentrate attention on those elements that are serious, with serious people. One engages in serious debates. And I think there were a large number of serious people throughout the Afro-American community who supported UNITA when they should have been leading uncompromising support for the MPLA, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola. At that particular historical juncture, it was immediately obvious that there was a startling coincidence, a startling convergence between the positions of certain individuals who called themselves progressive revolutionaries and who in fact regard themselves as the essence of revolution. Yet their position coverage with that of the U.S. imperialism. And this amazing historical convergence needs to be understood. I assume that there are elements within the audience who took that position, and I am not going to engage in any abuse of those elements. I am simply going to say I believe the positions was historically completely incorrect, and I will indicate how I believe that era took place. First thing is UNITA gained a certain popularity in this country in the very late 60s and the early 70s, particularly in the period of the rise of the African liberation movement and the like. I was following the process, so I know what they were becoming more exposed and more popular in this country, and that they use certain very opportunistic political tactics and techniques. They simply appealed to the growing black consciousness by saying, quote, "Inside of Angola, we stand for the elevation of the black man to a position of dignity and rule, and the MPLA stands for the elevation of whites and They use the M word. They use the M word, which indicates a biracial black and white person. They use the M word, which I cannot use, over indigenous African people. That was the standard line in the late 60s and early 70s. And they would then say, quote, look at the MPLA. It has so-and-so who is in its executive, who is white, who is Portuguese. It has so many half white, half black people who are on the central committee. It has so-and-so who is married to a white woman, President Nato, and so on and so forth. And in the context of the U.S., I think that those are very telling points in the context of the black struggle in this country. When brothers and sisters were going through that terrible period of self-identification, trying to extract themselves out of the dominant white culture, I think that those points made a great deal of impact, particularly because the NPLA was not really seeking out influence the Afro-American population or much of the American population. Let me get my water real quick. People are coming in. It still says 178. That's fucking funny. Everything's running smoothly. Internet running smoothly, I'm thinking. Yeah. So what is one reason why the UNITA gained in popularity? And when we examine that very carefully, we must of course admit that to declare blackness is very easy thing to do. I mean, the same character who was mobilizing black mercenaries was also in the forefront of declaring his blackness, and he would call himself a Garveyite, and so on and so forth. To declare for blackness is one of the easier things to do, once one recognizes the opportunity inherent in that situation. But surely, we need to go further than that. We need to examine first, rather the reality in Angola was the reality as portrayed by the UNITA. We need to go further and ask whether the historical experience in Angola would be so easily assimilated into the historical experience of black people in the U.S. that Afro-Americans should run to make a judgment on Angola on the basis of some knowledge they had that so-and-so was married to a white, or that so-and-so was a half white, half black person. I'm not going to say the M word, everybody. I'm not going to say that. Because the central understanding that we must reach is that any situation must be examined on its own historical merits. That is called, quote, race. In the U.S. is not the same thing as the might be called race in Angola. In fact, in this country, those who are all called black are used to be called. They say black, but in the other term at the end. If they went to Angola, they would be distinguished. Distinguished would be a distinguished many as half black, half white. The M word. I'm going to say the M word for now on. I think everybody knows what it is. If we want to understand Angola and the complex of the relationship between social strata and race and so forth, we must then understand Angola. We cannot sit in Washington or in Detroit and imagine that what we are seeing around the blocks of Angola block is Angola society. And this seems to me to be of the mistakes which the brothers made when they tried to transform a very simplistic understanding of black-white relationships in the judgment of whether they would support the NPLA or support UNITA. One is reminded here of some of the things which Fanon wrote in regard to Africa when he was talking about the pitfalls of national consciousness. He was talking about pitfalls of African national consciousness. Now we can apply that to the pitfall of black national consciousness, which is to say that national consciousness is clearly a liberating force. But at a certain point, it can provide blinkers. It can turn into blinkers and constitute a barrier for further understanding of the real world. What's going on? Who's this guy? Oh my God, we're doing that thing again. The second and more widespread factor, and one that ultimately proved to be most decisive for many black progressives, was the notion that the UNITA was a Maoist movement. And these left forces who opposed the MPLA were moving from the starting point of supporting Marxist-Leninism Mao Zedong thought. Because that's what it is. It wasn't Maoism yet. It was Mao Zedong thought. In their own words, they have a vision of an analysis of contemporary society wherein they identify as the principal contradiction between the two superpowers. They argue further that the more dangerous force of the Soviet socialist imperialism, because it's more covert, it's more subtle, and because it ultimately can be more powerful since capitalist imperialism is on the wane. And therefore, in the situation in which the Soviets are involved, one has to take a stand on the opposite side. Now that my disagreement now, what is my disagreement with that position? I should not go into all of my disagreements, because I do not want any sort of global confrontation. I am not in favor of trying to resolve all the problems of the world at the same time in a single stroke, so that I am not going to attempt to deal with the postulation about the principal contradiction and its implications. What we are going to ask is, how does that relate to Angola with its specific characteristics? If someone holds that belief as a sincere revolutionary tenet, when that person approaches Angola, how is it that such a belief ends by placing such forces on the side of those who have for 500 years oppressed the African people? What explanation does such a person give to the Angolians who have been engaged since 1960s in armed struggles against Portuguese, against NATO, who at the end of that struggle found they were faced with the South African, and with an escalation of U.S. support to the so-called liberation movement, which had been harassing the genuine freedom fighters for many years. Why is the best book to read on any? Why is the best book to read on any? Why? I don't know why. I don't know. I don't know what you mean. I'm sorry, sir. The AI debating Angola history. Join the discussion. What the fuck? What's that going on? I don't want that. Why is that doing that? So, from a dialectical perspective and a scientific perspective, we struggle and work to discover the correct line. It is only from the theological perspective that one knows the correct line because of revealed truth. And it seems to me that the limitations of that position were very clear, revealed in the Angolan situation. I have not seen a single analysis from forces claiming that they had the quote correct line, which meant opposing the Soviets. Not a single analysis of what was going on inside Angola. It was purely external, and I do not believe we can proceed on that basis, because he's talking about we have to meet the people where they're at. We have to meet the phenomenon that's happening where we're at. We have to continuously do that. in order to examine the concrete analysis of the situation and conditions. All right, we're on section 2, unit 2, development and underdevelopment. I think he's going to go in exactly what defines underdevelopment and what defines development. I'm just making an inquiry. Chapter 7, historical roots of African underdevelopment. Thank you, Josh. Thomas Santez, in his survey of interpenetration of economic development, observed that, in contrast to the bourgeoisie theories, Marxist writing, quote, explains the phenomenon of economic underdevelopment, the perspectives of eliminating it, and the concrete question of further development, always in relations to history, within the framework of historical interrelations. Thank you. Alaikum salam. By concentrating on the main driving forces of social and economic development, and by analyzing phenomenons and their cause as dialectical interdependence, end quote. He then goes on to draw attention to the fact that, quote, it is particularly and naturally a national theoreticians of the underdeveloped countries themselves who stress the international aspects of economic underdevelopment and the latter's relations with colonialism, even if without any sign of Marxist mentality, end quote. It is not accident that the Tanzanian, the Justian, I don't know how to say this name, Raruwemowi, puts forward the view that the poverty of development, quote unquote, countries is to be largely traced to the historical relationships to the metropolitan countries and the former colonial countries. The West Indian Norman Gavin, in the study of multinational corporations and dependent underdevelopment in mineral exports economies, end quotes, also urges that the origins of institutional dependency must be sought in the historical evolution of the economies for centuries before. Both are products of and spokesmen for colonized portions of the globe, reacting against the metropolitan bias of standard bourgeoisie approaches to the problem of development. Yeah. Unfortunately, historical dimensions to the analysis of the African economy are lacking because inquiry into African past as conducted by historians has seldom concerned itself with seeking explanations for the present international division of labor and all that goes with it. My examination here does not pretend to be exhaustive, but hopefully it will shed some light on the coming into being of the structural features associated with development and underdevelopment. For instance, in the economy of Western Europe and Africa, because the economic history of Europe is better known, more emphasized will be placed on African underdevelopment, and for similar reasons, the colonial period will be neglected relative to the centuries commonly referred to as pre-colonial, quote unquote. Sego. Become a fan. It's telling you to become a fan, wheelchair lumping. The first significant thing about the internationalization of trade in the late 15th centuries was that Europeans took the initiative and went to other parts of the world. No Chinese junk reached Europe, and if any African canoes reached the Americas, it is sometimes maintained that they did not establish two-way links. This meant that what was called international trade was nothing but an extension overseas of European interests. Insofar as there was a strategy to international trade and the production that supported it, that strategy was firmly in European hands, and specifically in the hands of the maritime nations from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. They owned and directed the great majority of the world's ocean-going vessels, and they controlled the financing of trade between the four continents. Africans had little clue as to the tri-continental linkage between Africa, Europe, and the Americas, nor did the inhabitants of the Moluccas, Moliccas, have any notion of the European market into which their species were directed by European ships. Europe had a monopoly of economic intelligence of the international exchange system seen as a whole. For Western Europe was the only sector capable of viewing the system as a whole. Europeans used the superiority of their ships, the cannon, to gain control of all the world's waterways. For instance, force was necessary in the case of the Sino-Japanese trade, and with regards to the Arabic people in East Africa. Once European hegemony was achieved, it gave them the power to allocate roles to every other part of the world, so that the various inputs intermingled with the benefits of Western Europe. Even the whites in the Americas were for 3 centuries on the periphery of a system whose center of power was Western Europe. Initially, the Portuguese, Spanish, and the Dutch had the most fair-flung interest. When the when the Iberians were still in command of a major sector of world trade in the first half of the 17th century, they engaged in buying cotton, clothes in India to exchange for slaves in Africa to mine gold in America. Part of the gold in the Americas would then be used to purchase spices and silks from Far East. The concept of metropole and colony did not require European settlement. In Africa and in Asia, it was sufficient that local economies were in some way drawn into the web of international commerce. It is interesting to note that what is called international law, quote unquote, also reflected the early division of the trading world into metropoles and dependencies. The law recognized by different states was governing the high seas as was understandably European and not Indonesian or African. On the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean, the African more likely than not was an object rather than a subject or master of the law. Slavers in a Dutch slave ship were legally protected against privacy because they were Dutch property. The law of the metropoles became the law of international relations. This is yet another reflection of the commercial hegemony established by Europe at the onset of the epoch of international trade. Making sure, looking back. Good evening, listeners. Wait, what is this? This is weird. All right. Africa had little say in the determination of the imports and exports content of its commerce with Europeans. Europe's exports were an extension of domestic production of the demand for a wide range of articles such as Dutch linen, Spanish iron, English pewter, Portuguese wine, French brandy, Vietnam glass beads, German muskets, and so forth. Europeans were also able to unload on the African continent goods which had become unsaleable in Europe. Thus, items like old sheets, cast-offs, uniforms, technologically outdated firearms, and the whole range of polka tile found guaranteed markets in Africa. Africans slowly became aware of the possibility of demanding and obtaining better imported goods, and pressure was exerted on the captains of ships. But the interplay between African buyer and European supplier was extremely circumscribed. Europeans were most concerned about regional variants, like the demand for copper in eastern Nigeria and iron on the upper Guinea coast. They also took into account shifting tastes within any given region, but the overall range of trade goods which left Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Liverpool was determined almost exclusively by the pattern of production and consumption within Europe itself. Okay, I hate the concept of whiteness. Whiteness needs to be eradicated because it's an antagonistic thing towards non-white people. It's been seen to be genocidal. So I hate the concept of whiteness that was invented to dominate. The effectiveness of Europe's power to make decisions within the international trade system was best seen in the way that it selected what Africa would export. A complete list of African export commodities since the 15th century would include things such as civet perfume, ambergris, indigo, monkeys, and feathers. But of course, those were mere curiosities. The economically significant commodities were very few and were chosen by Europeans in accordance with European needs. I'm not ashamed of being Irish. I want to explore my Irish roots, but whiteness can fuck off. The ships of the Portuguese discoverers gave the search for gold the highest priority, partly on the basis of well-known information that West African gold reached Europe across the Sahara, and partly on the basis of speculation. You didn't hear what I said. The Portuguese were successful in abstaining gold in parts of West Africa and in East Central Africa, and it was the Gold Coast which attracted the greatest attention from Europeans in the 16th and 17th century. The number of forts built was a testimony to this, and the nations involved included the Scandinavians and the Germans' Principality of Brandenburg, as well as other colonial stalwarts, such as the British, Dutch, and Portuguese. However, since gold was limited to very small areas of Africa, as far as Europeans were aware, the principal export was human beings. Only in a very few places at given times was there an export of another commodity of equal or greater importance. For instance, in Senegal, there was gum. In Sierra Leone, camwood. In Mozambique, ivory. All right. Why Europeans were anxious to Okay, why Europeans were anxious to acquire gold would appear to acquire no explanation, but part from the universal fascination with the yellow metal. One must take into account that it was a direct response to the pressing need for Europe, namely the need for gold coins, which the growing capitalist money economy, camwood, was also called into existence as a West African export because of the expanding capitalism in Europe. It was mainly utilized for its yield of red dye, and it ceased to be a value in the 19th century when European technological advance created substitutes. Ivory from Africa passed into European industries as distinct from artwork during and after the 16th century, once the lathe and had made a precision cutting possible. Its export to Europe continued well into the colonial period into plastic substitutes, undermined import sectors such as billiards and bowling ball manufacturer. It is in the light of its own needs and technologies that Europe has always made a decision concerning what Africa should export and concerning the beginning and decline of each export commodity. The most crucial of these decisions for pre-colonial quote-unquote African trade was Europe's allocation to Africa of the role of supplier of human captives to be used as slaves in various parts of the world. Getting another drink. Thank you. Why is the AI doing this? Did I bring the AI in? I have no idea why it's doing this. Weird. It is a valid question to ask why Africans accept the terms of what they should export, and particularly with regard to the sales of human beings. One suggestion, which was at one time widely wait, what does it say? It's showing on my end. It's fucking weird. Widely accepted and unchallenged was that African society already had slaves, which were simply handed over to European buyers. The institutions of slavery has coexisted with and formed part of communal, feudal, and capitalist societies, but its widest incidence occurred when communalism was extensively broken down, which was not the case in Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries. The most likely explanation is that captives were made in war, and it was responsible to assume that such fresh captives, as distinct from those who had earned a place in their captors' society and family structures, would have been considered readily expendable to European buyers. Seeing what's going on here, a lot of things. Thank you for the things. All right. One has also to take into account the offer of European commodity as a pole of attraction. Paradoxically enough, the influence of European goods was scarcely be attributed to their quality. On the contrary, things such as cheap European fabrics were inferior to African products, and this was recognized by buyers. However, they were brought to Africa in large quantities, so availability was the crucial factor. No doubt the novelty of European commodities also led to their being accepted in exchange for gold or human beings. Esteban Montoya, an African who ran away from a Cuban slave plantation in the 19th century, recalled that his people were wooed into slavery by the color red, diverting as his recollection may appear. It should not be dismissed lightly. he wrote as follow, and here's what he wrote. Hello. Here's what he wrote. It was the scarlet which did for the Africans. Both the kings and the rest surrendered without a struggle. When the kings saw that whites, I think the Portuguese were the first, were taking out these scarlet handkerchiefs, and black people were so excited by the scarlet that they ran down to the ships like sheep, and there they were captured. Black people has always liked scarlet. It was the fault of this color that they put them in change and sent them to America. That's what he wrote. In the Congo, the slave trade did not get underway without grave doubts and opposition from Africans who had established contact with Europeans. The king of the state of Congo clearly deified the nature of his expectation. I don't know if that's expectation. Let me make sure. Expectation. Yeah. From Europe. He asked for masons, priests, clerks, physicians, and the like. But instead, he was overwhelmed by slave ships sent by his Catholic brothers in Portugal. And a vicious trade was opened up by exploiting contradictions within the loosely structured Congo kingdom. It might be objected that the Congo king who took this stand against slavery had been converted to Christianity and was speaking as a Catholic. But there was little in Catholicism, either in Portugal or among the missionaries of Congo, which would have raised any sanguine hope that the Christian religion was in any way a barrier to the enslavement of Africans. With the date of the Congo episode being at the beginning of the 16th century, it can be legitimately be interpreted as a rare surviving evidence of an important aspect of the initial confrontation between Europe and Africans at the onset of the internationalization of trade and the onset of the Atlantic slave trade in particular. Who else is in here? Tella. All right. An African ruler had convinced of possibilities and mutual beneficial interchanged between his people and the European state, but the latter imposed a export specialization of human cargo. Once Africa and Europe became interlocked on the latter terms, it was beyond the capacity of any given African state or society to change the status quo, because Europeans reacted by force and other means of maintaining their position. This was exemplified in Angola, where the Portuguese employed an unusual number of their own troops and tried to wrest political power from Africans, with the resolution that was not customary to the epoch before colonial rule. The Angolan state of Matabom on the river of Kwango was founded around 1630 as a direct reaction against the Portuguese, with Queen Nexingan at its head. Matumba tried to coordinate resistance against the Portuguese in Angola, especially in the 1640s. So again, they were fighting. When the Dutch offensive against the Portuguese provided a European ally, Portugal gained the upper hand in 1648, but Matumba remained hostile, and the participation in the slave trade was largely in Abyance. Oh, okay, wait, that is a word. Let me go look up this word. Put it back. Thank you for the gifts, everybody. Let me make sure. Come on. Why am I not getting the thing? Thank you. A, B. There it is. This pad's going so slow.
Abeyance.
Abeyance, a state of temporary disuse or suspension. Okay, abeyance.
Abeyance.
Abeyance, as far as the state was concerned, for a quarter of a century, but slaving having become a major activity in the region. Mataumbo, I can't say his name, could not forever stand aside, so long as it opposed trade with the Portuguese. It was an object of hostility from neighboring African states, which had a modus vivendi with Europeans and slave trading. When Queen Nzinga, it's Nzinga, resumed business with the Portuguese in 1656, it was undoubtedly a major victory for the latter. Her change of name to Dona Ana de Suase was a very nominal concession to Christianity, but it symbolized a major decision-making role of the Portuguese within Angolan economy. A smaller but more specific example of African resistance of continued European imposition of trade in slaves comes from the Banga people, B-A-G-A people, in what is now the Republic of Guinea. The Banga lived in many states in Circa, S-I-R-C-A, in 1720, one of their leaders attempted to secure an alliance to stop the slave traffic. He was apparently defeated by local European resident traders, M-words, and other slave trading Africans. It was not difficult to understand why Europeans would have taken immediate steps to see that Tombo and his Banga followers did not opt out of the role allocated by them by Europe. A parallel which presents itself is the manner in which Europeans got together and waged the quote-unquote opium war against China in order to assure that the Chinese would continue to import the addictive drug that was so profitable for Western capital. Of course, it is only as a last resort that the capitalist metropoles need to use armed force to ensure the pursuit of favorable policies and periphery. Normally, economic weapons are sufficient within the same context of opposition to the slave trade. Dahomey found itself being brought to terms by being deprived of European imports, some of which had become necessities by the time that Dahomey had its altercation with European slave traders in the 1970s. 1970s. I'm sure that's the 18. The episode was worth careful scrutiny because of the conventional interpretation portrayed Dahomey as nothing but a bloody slave trading state, and make absolutely no mention of the determined opposition to the trade that was carried by Dahomey's greatest king, Aganji Trudeau. The fundamental pillar of the Dahomean conception of the state was that all Dahomeans were inalienable. The king required of his subject complete obedience, and they asked in turn for unqualified protection. Adijah Trudeau appreciated that European demand for slaves and the pursuit of slaving in and around Dahomey was incompatible with Dahomean's development. Between 1724 and 1726, he looted and burnt European forts and slave barracoons, and he reduced the trade from the quote-unquote slave coast to a mere trickle by blocking the path led to source of supply in the interior. European slave dealers were very bitter, and they tried to sponsor some African collaborators against Adeji Trudeau. They failed to unseat him or crush the Dahomean state, but in turn, Ajida failed to persuade them to develop new lines of economic activity such as local plantation agriculture and being anxious to acquire firearms and cowries through the Europeans, and he had to acquiesce in the resumption of slave trading in 1730. In 1730, I think it was supposed to be 1770s, I'm not sure. In 1730, oh my gosh, it's doing it to me again. In the 1730s, Dahomean slaving was placed under royal control and was far more restricted than previously. Yet the failure of this determined effort illustrates that a single African state at the time could not emancipate itself from European hegemony. The small size of the polities and the numerous political divisions made it so much easier for Europe to make the decision about Africans' role in world production and trade, because the nature of African exports was determined from outside the continent. Questions such as the level of output and price were also decided outside Africa. Time and time again, trade and slaves responded to various external stimuli. So, without saying, Africans did fight against the slave trade, and evidently was crushed. So they did fight against it, whether you like to say it or not. At first, the laborer was needed in Liberia and in the Atlantic Islands. So, as, oh my gosh, Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and the Canaries. Then came this period when the Great Antilles and the Spanish American mainland needed replacement for the indigenous who were victims of G-side, and then demanded the Caribbean and the mainland plantation societies had to be met. The records show direct correlations between levels of export from Africa and Europe, and European demanded for slave labor in this or that part of America plantation economy. When the Dutch took Pernambuco in 1634, the director of the Dutch West Indian Company immediately informed their agents on the quote Gold Coast that they were to take the necessary steps to pursue the trade in slaves and the adjacent coast east of Volta, thereby creating a famous quote slave coast end quote. When the British Islands of the Caribbean took to growing sugarcane, the Gambian was one of the first places to respond. Examples of this kind of external control can be instanced right up to the end of the trade, and this embraces Eastern Africa. Also, since European market in the Indian Ocean islands became important in the 18th and 19th centuries, and since American demand caused Mozambicans to ship around the Cape of Good Hope. Even medium and short run fluctuations in the volume of African trade were usually reflections of European conditions. The insistent. Let me make sure of this word. Let me make sure of the word. I swear to God, the time goes by so fast when reading this book. Oh my gosh. Incessant European wars of the mercantilist epoch were particularly decisive in this respect. There was a drastic fall in French shipping of Africa during the 7 Years' War, 1748 to 55. While both British and French shipping was absent from regular trade during the American War of Independence and the years of Anglo-French struggle that followed, the African, quote, producer, end quote, of a commodity such as captives was quite helpless in the face of these European practices. During the American War of Independence, Futa Dajallon, Djallon, and the neighboring countries of Sierra Leone became full of captives who had of necessity to be incorporated into a local system of production because they were kept hanging around for a long time with no ships in sight. It might seem to me to be laboring and obvious to emphasize that the fundamental characteristics of centuries of Afro-European trade was that its dimensions were determined outside of Africa, but it is equally obvious that local conditions were bound in some way to affect output, price, and European choice in particular parts of the continent in particular times. Thus, the local conditions around, say, the bight of Bafra and Lake Nicera would certainly have influenced the rate of extraction of captives at any given time. The emphasis on the overall global determinants is necessary in order to situate the mechanics of trade within Africa and their proper international perspectives, and in so doing, one can immediately perceive the striking similarities between the earlier commerce and the subsequent colonial and neo-colonial trades. Hello, Void. Hello, Sound by Sean. I hope you're still here if you are. The kind of benefits which Europe derived from this control of world commerce are well known. Although it is curious that the recognition of African major contribution to European development is usually made in works devoted especially to the subject, while European scholars of Europe often treat the European economy as if it were entirely autonomous. European economists of the 19th century certainly had no illusions about the interconnections between their national economies and the world at large. J.S. Mills went so far as to assert that as far as England was concerned, quote, the trade of the West Indies is hardly to be considered as external trade, but more resembles the traffic between town and country. Marx can also cite, in the same context, not as a heretic or as a ultimate authority, but merely because of the frankness of his comments. It was Marx who wrote that, quote, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment of minds of the aboriginal population, the turning of Africa into a commercial warren for the hunting of black skins, symbolized the rosy dawn of era of capitalist production, end quote. Central and South American gold and silver played a crucial role in meeting the need for coin in the expanding capitalist money economy, while African gold was also significant in this respect. African gold helped the Portuguese to finance further navigations around the Cape of Good Hope and into Asia. It was the main source for the Dutch mint in 17th century, which helped to secure Amsterdam as the financial capital of Europe in that period. And it is no coincidence that when the English struck a new gold coin in 1663, they called it the guinea, quote unquote. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, and for the most part of the 19th, the exploitation of Africa and African labor continued to be the source for the accumulation of capital to be reinvested in Western Europe. The African contribution to European capitalist growth extended over such vital sectors as shopping, insurance, and the association of capital, capitalist agriculture, and the capital good industry. Sometimes the efforts were modest and localized. Thus, the Saint Malo fishing industry was stimulated by the opening up of markets in the French slave plantation, while the Portuguese fishing industry also gained new buoyancy. Then there were more spectacular developments with the growth of seaport towns connected with Atlantic trade, notably Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Bordeaux, and Sevilla. Behind those ports were often emerged the manufacturing centers that gave rise to the notion of the, quote, industrial revolution, end quote. As Mantoux put it, quote, the growth of Lancashire, of all English countries, the one most deserving to be called the cradle of the factory system, depended first of all on the development of Liverpool and her trade, end quote. The connection between capitalism and slavery, as far as England is concerned, are adequately documented by Eric Williams. And Eric Williams is a title called Slavery and Capitalism, which is in our thing. A similar picture would emerge from the detailed study of French capitalism and slavery, given the fact that during the 18th century, the West Indies accounted for 20% of French external trade, much more than the whole of Africa in the present century. Of course, benefits were not always directly proportional to the amount of involvement of a given European state in the Atlantic trade. For instance, the enormous profit of Portuguese economy went into the hands of the more developed Western European capitalist nations, who supplied Portugal with capital, trade goods. Germany was included in this category, along with England and Dutch provinces in France. Commerce deriving from Africa helped a great deal to strengthen transnational links within the Western European economy, bearing in mind that American produced was the consequence of African labor. Brazilian deadwood, for example, were re-exported from Portugal into the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the Baltic. Passed into the continental cloth industry in the 17th century. Sugar from the Caribbean was exported from England and France to other parts of Europe to such an extent that Hamburg was the biggest sugar refining center in Europe. In the first half of the 18th century, Germany supplied manufacturers to Scandinavia, Holland, England, France, and Portugal for resale in France and Holland. In spite of competing mercantilist systems, found it necessary to exchange various classes of goods to better deal with African Africans for gold, slaves, and ivory. The financiers and merchants of Genoa were the powers behind the market of Lisbon and Seville, while Dutch bankers played a similar role with respect to Scandinavia and England. Western Europe, after all, was more than just an arbitrary geographical connotation. It was that part of Europe in which, by the 15th century, embryo capitalist relations already posed a challenge to feudalism, marking a further departure from the natural self-sufficient. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna look up this word. It says auto-tarnarchic economies. We're gonna look up what that means. I hope I said it right. Let's find out if I even said it right. So basically, Africa developed Europe. That is the moral of this story. Africa developed Europe. Oh my gosh, won't let me say it. Auto-tarchic. It's A-U-T-A-R-C-H-I-C. Means characterizing or relating to self-sufficiency and dependency, especially in the economic or political sense. Or it can mean self-ruled, like an autocratic rule. Huh. So it's autarchic. I don't know how to say it. Self-sufficient autotarchic economies of previous modes of production. When the Western European nation moved overseas, it was the product of an internal dynamic, which it was not navigated or even deflected by new trades with Africa, Asia, and America. And enclosures continued in the English countryside, and agriculture in Western Europe generally continued its slow rate of evolution, serving to support a larger population and to provide a more effective basis for wool and linen industries in particular. The rate of transformation. Hold on a second. Let me make sure. Okay. The rate of transformation in technology and in the socio-economic organization of industry was more rapid. African trade hindered none of these things. On the contrary, it sped up several aspects, including the integration of Western Europe as noted above. That is why the African connection contributed not merely to economic growth, which relates only to a quantitative dimensions, meaning just a lot of but also to real development in a structural sense. Conversely, it can be demonstrated that the contacts with Europe had no organic relationship to what Africa was doing previously, nor did they permit the reemergence of any rational continental or regional ties within Africa itself. Trade with Europe meant historical disruptions and disintegration, and those things proved crucial to Africans' underdevelopment. So what they did is they destroyed the economy, they destroyed trade routes. That's the whole reasons why there are countries, nation states in Africa that the imperialist countries divvied up and did that. That's the whole point. To fucking ruin trade between those things and make them trade with just Europe. And they get the short end of the stick, of course. Africans' internal trade was very limited up to the 15th century. Apart from North Africa, the Horn included, it was only East Africa that had foreign trade relations. The Portuguese sought with some success to replace the Arabic as the merchants who tied East Africa to India and to the rest of Asia. It was the Portuguese who came to carry most of the ivory which was marketed in India, while Indian clothes and beads were sold to East and West Africa for the Portuguese and the Dutch. By the Portuguese and the Dutch, sorry. The same applied to cowrie shells from East Indies. The next trade route between Africa and the Americas was an extension neither of the indigenous American economy nor the African economy. Its total rationale laid in Europe. In effect, therefore, Europe took the first steps towards transforming Africa, Asia, and America into economic satellites. It was at the very onset of international trade that there was established that radical pattern with Europe at the center of very few independent connections between non-European territories. Inside Africa itself, the period of trade which preceded the establishment of colonial rule was also determined by the state of affairs where there were ties between colony and metropole, but none between colony and colony. It will shortly be illustrated that trade with Europe arrested the development of numerous small African economies. Lack of economy integration in Africa is mainly a result of the fact because social formations in given geographical areas were not permitted to extend their productions and economy boundaries so as to generate trade with each other comparable to importance to that between each area and Europe. See what I mean? They kept them from trading for other African nations on purpose. This is the underdevelopment that Europe did to Africa. And again, in the beginning, not with fighting back, like the case of the Dahomies. There's no doubt that potential for independent economic development was present in a large number of localities based on local resources and skills. And those local economies multiplied and grew closer together. They were bound to create regional and continental markets, as in Europe and part of Asia, that had gone further along the same evolutionary path. In addition to blocking the possibilities of continued evolution, European trade also set in motion the process of active disintegration. Certain interior links established on the continent were broken down because European trade. That's more evidence. Several examples arose on the West African coast down to Angola because in those parts, European trade was most voluminous. And the surviving written records is also more extensive. When the Portuguese arrived in the region of modern Ghana in the 1470s, they had few commodities to offer local inhabitants in exchange for covenanted gold. However, they were able to train ships from Dahomey. They were able to transship from Dahomey supplies of cotton clothes, beads, and female slaves, which were sellable on the Gold Coast, quote unquote. Jesus Christ. The indication are that the Portuguese were responding to a given demand on the quote unquote Gold Coast, so that a previous trade must have been in existence between the two regions. The Akan were gold producers. And the people of Benin were specialist craftsmen who had a surplus of cloth and beads, which they manufactured themselves. As an expansionist state, Dahomey also had access to prisoners of war, while the Akan seemed concerned with building their own population and labor force. So they acquired female captives from Dahomey and rapidly integrated them as wives. When the Portuguese intervened In this exchange, it was subordinate to the overall interests of European trade. As soon as Portugal and the other European nations had sufficient goods so as not to be dependent on the re-export of certain commodities from Dahomey, then all that remained were the links between the Gold Coast and Europe on the one hand, and between Dahomey and Europe on the other. That represented the destruction of whatever potential existed for the creating and regional markets with its own internal logic. Again, destroying internal markets, trades between regions and people, saturating it, making it bad, giving them secondhand things, and taking their quantities and qualities of products that they create. And then, Jay, I'm still doing this, so you're gonna have to wait. And then taking those commodities like sugar and taking them to the metropoles, the capitalist centers, to have them produce commodities to be sold back into the market. I'd like to join what good and bad for markets. I don't understand what you're meaning, but I'm reading right now. Probably Dahomey products reached the Gold Coast, quote unquote, by percolating through what is now Benin and Togo, using as far as possible the creeks behind the coast. Therefore, it would have been more convenient when Europeans established a direct link across the open seas. The superiority of European at sea was the greatest strategic value, along with their organizational ability. This was illustrated in several places, beginning with the Upper Guinea coast and the Cape Verde Islands, where Portuguese settlers broke into the pattern of local trade ever since 1460s. They intervene in the transfer of raw cotton and indigo dye from the African community to another, and Cape Verdean settlers went a step further in establishing and flourishing cotton growing and cotton manufacturing industries. They used labor and techniques from the mainland to export it, and exported the finished products along the length of the Gold Coast down to El Mena. What does this guy say? I'm not worried about, dude, we're talking about, oh my God, this guy. These people, they come in and they just fucking just say statements without reading the fucking book. Jay, read the fucking book. Read the fucking book. Portuguese also took over the trade and local cowries in Congo, the trade in salt along the Angolan coast, and the trade in high quality palm cloth between Loango and southern Angola. In some instances, they achieved dominance not... She's still talking. Why we don't read... Dude, then you don't know nothing about this book then. You're just talking out of your ass. Read the fucking book. Sorry, everybody, but read the fucking book, my friend. Well, now you got blocked. Oh well. Dominance, not just because of their ships and commercial skills, but also by the use of force, providing they were operating on the littoral and could bring their cannon into play. The disruption of transactions between the Gold Coast and the Ivory Coast followed that pattern. A strong coastal canoe trade existed between the two regions, with the people of Cape Lowohu sailing past Cape 3 Points to sell their cloth as far east as Accra. I think that's gone right now, I'm not sure. The Portuguese set up a fort in Axiom near Cape 3 Points to service gold trade with the hinterlands, and one of its incidental functions was to restrict the east-west coastal African trade. Again, taking control of trade and economies. What was up with that dude? That dude is just like, dude hasn't even read the book. And then says, why should we read your book? So that you can oh my God, just fucking hate. Some people are just, you know what I mean? They prohibited Axiom residents from going to Cape Lahu, and they stopped canoes from the Ivory Coast from traveling eastbound Axiom. The purpose was obviously to make both areas discrete economic entities exclusively tied to Europe. I'm going to look at something real quick, everybody. Woo, this is a long chapter. All right. What was doubly detrimental to African attempts to integrate their own economies was the fact that when Europeans became middlemen in local trade networks, they did not mainly to facilitate the extractions of captives and thereby subordinating the whole economy to slave trade. In Upper Guinea, the Portuguese and their inward people, descendants in the Cape Verde Islands and on the coast engaged in a large variety of trade permutations involving cotton, dye, cola nuts, and European products. The purpose of it all was to fill the holds of slave ships calling a Gambian, Kachu, Basu, and Bay of Sierra Leone, and so on. In Congo/Angola, the same picture emerges. The salt, Namzimbu shells, and palm cloth that came into Portuguese hand made up for their shortage of trade goods and served to purchase captives in different parts of the coast and deep into interior. This element of subordination and dependency is crucial to an understanding of Africans' underdevelopment today, and its root lie far back in the era of international trade. It is also worth noting that there is a type of pseudo-integration which is compatible with dependency. In contemporary times, it takes the form of free trade area in the developing world. They use the number 3, which are made to order for the penetration of multinational corporations, while from the 15th century onward, the pseudo-integration took the form of the interlocking of African economies over long distances from the coast, so as to allow the passage of human captives and ivory from a given point inland to a given port on the Atlantic or Indian Ocean. So like they're going to talk about this more of underdevelopment and development when I read how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So let's see here. The West African gold trade was not destroyed, but it became directly dependent on European buyers and being diverted from the northward routes across Sahara within the savannah belt of the West Sudan, quote unquote. The trans-Saharan gold trade was nourished one of the most highly developed political zones in all Africa from the 15th century onward, but it was more convenient for Europe to obtain its gold on the west coast than through North Africa intermediaries, and one is left to speculate on what might have occurred in Western Sudan. If there had been a steady increase in gold trade over the 17th and 18th centuries, nevertheless, there is something to be said in favor of African trade with Europe. In this particular commodity, gold production involved mining and an ordered system of distribution within Africa. Akan country, and parts of Zimbabwe and Mozambique sustained flourishing social political systems up to the 19th century, largely because of gold production. It was the trade in slaves that completely undermined the situation in West, East, and Central Africa. For the procurement of captives was based on warfare, banditry, and social distortion. A considerable body of writing is now coming into existence on the topic of the consequence of the Atlantic slave trade on Africa, and much of it purports to show that earlier views of the completely negative impact of trade are ill-founded. Indeed, some individuals are preoccupying themselves with highlighting the main beneficial effects of the slave trade on Africa. The whitewash trend is another facet of the distortions produced when capitalism tries to provide itself with moral justifications. Apologists rely on such flimsy arguments as, quote, Africa benefits by getting European goods, end quote, and, quote, new food crops were introduced, end quote, as though Europe had to be enslaved before it got to enjoy the potato from the Native American indigenous societies. These genres of scholarship stresses the fact that certain African kingdoms grew stronger during the centuries of enslaving, and it assumes that the connection was a positive one. The truth is that some areas continue to develop, and they did so in spite of slave trading, although all who participated were warped. Was it warped? To the greater or lesser extent, and all were reduced to a state of dependency. Many things remain uncertain about the slave trade and its consequences for Africa, but the overall picture of destructiveness is clear, and that destructiveness can be shown to be the local consequence of the recruitment of captives of Africa, as distinct from their sale at coastal ports. One of the uncertainties concerns the basic question of how many Africans were exported. This has long been an object of speculation, with the estimates ranging from a few millions to 100 million. The study by Phil Curtin, The Atlantic Slave Trade, a Census, has suggested a figure of about 10 million Africans landed alive in the Americas, the Atlantic Islands, and Europe. That figure may well be low in spite of the author's assertion to the contrary, because so many of import figures in the Americas were given out by individuals who deliberately minimized numbers in order to defraud revenue collection and the volume of, quote, contraband. Arrivals is difficult to measure. However, if this low figure was accepted on the basis for evaluating the impacts of slaving on Africa as a whole, the conclusion that could legitimately be drawn would confound those attempting to make light of the experience. As Curtin was aware, quote, the cost of the slave trade in human life was many times the number of slaves landed in the Americas. For every slave landed alive, other people died in warfare along the bush, paths leading to the coast, awaiting shipment, or in the crowded insanitary conditions of the Middle Passage. So what they're saying is they took count of the Africans that survived the trip, but they need to tally the ones that were procured and died during that procurement of the exporting them to like the coastal regions to be able to be exported out. So yeah, so the number's got to be higher than 10 million on this guy's case. On any base figures of Africans who landed alive in Americas, one would have to make an increment to cover mortality and transshipment, which I gotta finish up, which averaged in the vicinity of 15 to 20%. There were also other deaths between time of capture and time of embarkation. Most important of all, given that warfare was a principal means of obtaining captives, it is necessary to estimate the number of people killed or maimed in order to appreciate the extent of the millions who were taken alive. The resultant figure, a considerable multiply of 10 million, would represent the number from the population and labor force of Africa because of the establishment of slave production by Europeans in the Americas. It is a loss that would have to be evaluated in the light of age and sex selection of other features. Slave traders preferred their victims between 15 and 35 years of age, with a ratio of 2 men to 1 woman. They often accepted younger children, but rarely any older person. They shipped the most healthy wherever possible, and even took pains in to choose those who had smallpox and were thereby immunized. All right, here we go. Let me see. I'm not good at finding stopping points, everybody. But that might be a good stopping point. Absence of data of the size of African population in the 15th century makes it impossible to carry out a scientific assessment. Maybe I should read this part. Absence of data about the size of Africans' population in the 15th century makes it impossible to carry out any scientific assessment of the results of the population outflow. But nothing suggests that there was an increase in the continent's population over the centuries of enslaving. Although that was the trend in other parts of the world, lack of increase or even slight increases would have represented a deficit, quote unquote, in terms of population projections, since fewer babies were born that would otherwise have been the case if millions of childbearing age had not been eliminated. Finally, on the particular topic, it is essential to recognize that the Atlantic slave trade on the Indian Ocean has been called, quote, the East African slave trade, and the, quote, the Arab slave trade, for so long that it obscures the extent to which it was the European slave trade, when the slave trade was East Africa, as it is at its height in the late 18th century and in the early 19th century. The designation of captives was the plantation society of Mauritanias, a reunion of, oh my gosh, the Seychelles, as well as the New World via the Cape of Good Hope. Besides African laboring as slaves from Zanzibar to Persia in the 16th and 19th centuries, where all ultimately serving the European capitalist system, which had become all pervasive. The Sultan of Zanzibar did not eat from cloves himself. Hold on a second. I'm trying to find a stopping point. Okay, I think I might have found one. Let's find one. The emphasis of population loss as such, is highly relevant to the question of social economic development. In recent times, since imperial agencies have decided on the Malthusian line of the developing world, quote unquote, it is being forgotten that population growth played a major role in European development in providing labor market and the pressures which led to further advance. The Japanese population growth had similar positive effects, while the other parts of Asia, which remained pre-capitalist in size of the population, led to a much more intensive exploration of the land than has ever been the case in what is still a sparsely peopled African continent. Even in the absence of the statistics, it seems that West Africa was always more densely populated section of the continent than either Central or East Africa, and it was there that the brunt of the slaving fell, warping the development of some of the most advanced areas in all of Africa, such as Yoruba land, Ngobola land, and Akin countries. I think I'm gonna. Okay, it's gonna go on to African. I need to stop. It's 8. I'm gonna have to go back a couple paragraphs back. So I stopped on page 112. On the first paragraph where it says African economy activities. I did the best I could. So we'll figure out if that was a good stopping point. I might have to go back a couple of paragraphs. But like, yeah, the whole the whole thing, yes. Now he's particularly talking about the underdeveloped, the snatching of people, the taking, the destroying of trade routes, the destroying of economies, the destroying of trades between each country, the splitting up, making countries only trade or be forced to do things with the colonial entities that they're underfoot on, like only with them, and hardly at all with others within. Highly underdeveloped. Green Giant. What's up, Doodly?
Hello.
What would you like to say?
It makes sense why they wouldn't allow. Oh, funny. Sorry. Attention span. It made sense why they wouldn't allow for internal trading. Like it makes sense that they wouldn't want African people to have a chance to gain power
and to be connected with one another too. You know what I mean? They want them to keep them separated because connection and mass movements scare capitalists and imperialist capitalists, especially when they're looting that country to benefit them. So again, we can say that Africa developed Europe, the Americas, and in America, like Africa helped develop those places through their exploitation and looting, looting of the African continent. You know?
Yeah. And I also want to say, I love the way that you read.
You do?
Yeah. You're like, you're like, okay, but I want to continue reading.
Yeah, I could probably read this book all day, honestly.
Yeah.
But like, there's an example of what they did. They allowed, like he said, they allowed for minimum trade, but like in connection of like paying a tax. Or what they did is, yes, we'll let you go, but we're going to give you some European supplies. You must sell this. And when you come back, you need to give us what you sold. And then we'll allow you to go progress further and sell your stuff. So it was not without taxes, in a sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they were always putting stipulations on it that made it to where they had more control over it.
Yeah, because like in how Europe underdeveloped Africa, he talks about like this simple thing, that each country has a different area code, because like some people have like family because they lived regionally, had families in other countries, but they would have to pay a phone cost because each country has its own area code. You know what I mean? And they made it so like if you want to reach out to your family, you have to pay. You know what I mean? When they were connected without that, they were regionally connected, you know? Hello, what's up, Void? What would you like to add?
I just say I just wanted to add. Whoa.
That's cool. That's cool. But this is a good book. I can't wait to start reading the next one, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I think this will go into that. I think that was one of his last works. I think so. I think Grounding with My Brothers was his first one, and then this one. I'm not sure. But anyways, does anybody else have anything to say?
I invited the Doodley up again.
Oh, so Doodley was forced to come up. Jeez, Doodley.
I like inviting the Woodley whenever you finish reading. It makes the boy laugh.
That's cool. That's cool. I appreciate it. Well, if anybody doesn't have anything to say or wants to talk more about something or has questions before I close out, I'm going to give you the last moment of truth. Anybody?
If anybody is able to, if anybody is watching, I still is in big need of mutual aid. So if anybody can check out Mutual. If anybody can have a look at the links in bio, and support, that would be really cool. Hi, Jen. Kia ora. Yeah. And the Woodley is the Woodley.
That's funny.
I'm sorry. Outside conversation was happening. Much love. Take care, y'all.
All right. Thank you for coming in, Jen. I'm just finishing up. I appreciate you coming in and reposting, though. I start, Jen, if you know, I start 6:30 Central Time. I don't know if you're in a different country. Is Jen in a different country? Anybody know?
Yeah, they're in the homeland.
They're in New Zealand?
Yeah.
Okay.
Aotearoa. Okay, apparently I can't even speak Te Reo today. But yeah.
Okay. And so like an hour and a half back. So think an hour and a half back. Yeah, we started 90 minutes ago. So if you ever want to show up and hang out and listen, let me know. All right, everybody. I wish you all a good night. I'm going to go feed Rufus. Good night.
Rufus.